When I was just 3 years old, I saw this bike in my driveway at the home that I lived in. Without hesitation, I went outside to go take a closer look at it. Now, at this point in my life, I've never been taught how to ride a bike with training wheels, let alone with just 2 wheels. I saw other kids in my neighborhood riding the bike, so I figured that I could too. So I jumped on it and just started pedaling. Now, at this point in my life, I don't know what fear is like, and I had nothing to fear when I jumped on this bike. I was unaware that I could have lost control and got hit by a car or just simply fallen and broken a bone. I was too young to understand all of that. I've never really encountered this type of fear, and therefore I haven't learned it yet. In my mind, there's one thing that I know. If those kids can ride a bike, so can I. So after staring at the bike for long enough, I decided to hop on it, and I began pedaling around the driveway, kind of in circles, and eventually I veered off into the road. Now, at this point, my parents had found out that I am no longer in the house, and they have no clue where I'm at, so they come out and they start yelling at me. But that anger quickly faded because they had realized that I had just hopped on a bike without ever being taught and strolled down the road, so they were kind of amazed and angry at the same time. The moral of the story is, I saw the bike and I went for it because I had nothing to fear. I was unaware of how bad it could have ended, therefore I didn't think about it. I didn't have the voices in my head telling me that this was a bad idea. I didn't have past experiences to draw from to give me evidence as to why I shouldn't do it. I wasn't worried about what other people were going to think if I tried and failed. I wanted to ride the bike, so I did. Fast forward a few years later, when I'm around 7 or 8 years old, I was playing Truth or Dare with one of my friends at this neighborhood park that we had. And this whole park was made of metal except the slides. We were playing Truth or Dare without the truth, meaning we were just daring each other to do stupid things. So he dares me to climb on top of this tunnel that we had and jump off the tunnel onto this metal platform. And in between the metal platform and the tunnel, there was, I would say, like 5 or 6 stairs. And they were like the grooved metal stairs, right? And without hesitation, again, I'm like, yo, like this is easy, I got this. So I'm climbing up the tunnel to get on top of it, and once I'm up there, I'm like, this it's a little higher than I thought it was gonna be, because the tunnel's like 7 feet tall off the ground, and then I'm standing on top of that. But I'm like, you know what, I got this, like this is easy. And so I'm like putting my shoes down into the tunnel, like the grip, because it's a little wet and raining, so trying to make sure my grip is good to go. The adrenaline starts running, and I'm like, yeah, here we go, this is it. So I count down from 3, 2, 1, and I jump. I jump as high as I can and as far as I can, except my feet slipped out from underneath me, so I ended up face planting straight down into the metal stairs. Now I'm mad, right? I did not accomplish my goal and I failed the dare, so I lose the game, right? And I look at my buddy Devin, who was there at the time with me, and he looks at me like he just saw a ghost. And I was like, yo, like what's going on? Like I paused in my head, but I paused looking at him because I was scared of what he was scared of. And he pointed at my head, it was like, dude. And I was like, what? And I grabbed my head and I can feel this blood gushing from my head and down my face by the time I put my hand up to my head. So instantly, as any 7 or 8 year old would do, I started screaming and I ran all the way home and I started beating on my mom's door to open up the door. She's telling me to hang on and all this stuff. And she opens up the door finally, and I'm just literally head to toe covered in blood. And it took 8 towels to clean up my blood, and I had to go to the hospital, get stitches. I was fine. But the thing is, with this story, is this was the first time in my life that I had experienced any type of I'm gonna die type fear. Like I literally thought I was gonna die. And that was a very scary thought for an 8-year-old. And a few months later, I went back to the same park after I was healed up and everything like that. And I go and I climb the tunnel. This time I'm just by myself, and I'm on top of the tunnel looking at it, and I'm telling myself that I'm gonna jump. I have to redeem myself, right? Like I can't just not do it. And it's not raining today, so that's not a problem. And I convinced myself fully that the rain is why I failed, not because I couldn't do it. So hey, perfect opportunity. And so as I'm looking at the platform to reach on top of the tunnel, I'm like, here it is. We're gonna do it. Nobody's gonna be here, but we're gonna do it anyways. I count down from 3 in my head. 3, 2, the blood starts pumping, the adrenaline starts running, and I hit 1, and I go to jump, except I don't. I'm scared. completely scared out of my mind to jump. I start shaking, I get down, and I start beating myself up because I'm like, yo, what happened? Like, this is easy. I know I can do it, but why won't I do it? And it's because at this moment, I now have something to fear. I have data collected in my head as to what can happen if I try this. And my mind is starting to think worst case scenario. And in this moment is a moment that would change my life forever, but I didn't know it, but it changed the way that I thought for the rest of my life. I used to be adventurous. There was a time in my life where I feared nothing. I was the kid doing backflips off houses at 10 years old, dropping in on 12-foot half pipes at 11, failing over and over but continuing to try until I got it. I had pride in myself knowing that I wouldn't give up just because it seemed scarier that I would fail. Being relentless in the process and trying over and over again became my identity. But as I grew older, things began to change. I noticed this difference in the way that I was thinking. Instead of wanting to do something or seeing the goal being achieved, I imagined the worst case scenario. And it wasn't just about when it came to doing these stunts or whatever I had for fun, but it started going into my regular day life of just simply thinking about going out to eat, but being nervous because I think somebody might be blowing up the place as I'm trying to eat there. Just crazy things like that would begin to consume my mind every single day, and it completely changed the way that I lived my life. My childhood wasn't great. My parents split up when they were 3. They hated each other. I was oftentimes the middleman of their arguments, so I heard a lot of stuff that I shouldn't have heard, especially at that young of an age. Both battled with severe depression, anxiety, drug addiction. It was a violent household. Like there's so many stuff that I don't want to get into, yada yada yada, you get the point. But what I do want to talk about is the things that happened in my childhood that affect the mental aspect of my life and my today's world. Once a baby is born, 14 months to 15 years old are extremely important for a child. It is in this time frame of someone's life where their subconscious mind is being programmed. Everything you do and everything you say is programmed into that child's brain. Every time you react to something a certain way and that kid is watching, that kid is downloading that program. Before I even had my own consciousness and could act or think on my own, there was a lot of things that were programmed into my mind, especially a lot of things with like violence and bad ways of thinking and constantly being stuck in a stress response, which I had no clue obviously about any of that until I got older. But a lot of what I learned when I was a kid was violence was the answer to solving your problems. I started getting older, like around middle school. I started getting into a lot of trouble. I got kicked out of my middle school completely for threatening to do something to my social studies teacher, and I had to go see a psychiatrist and all this stuff and yada yada yada. And I just noticed that I started to become extremely aggressive towards people, especially my mom. Didn't even know it at the time, but I was just simply acting based off what I was seeing as a child growing up. I didn't realize it at the time either, but I was operating in a fight or flight mode 24/7 because that's what my parents did. That is how I was taught to operate. As I got into my late teens, I made the decision that I want to completely end all the mental health disorders and drug issues that we have going on in our family. And I wanted it to start with me. I set out to better myself and it was working. I started researching psychology and started to understand and process my childhood better. I was healthier mentally. I started reading self-help books. I noticed my reactions began to change when I got upset or frustrated. I started to rebuild who I was at the core for the better of my life. My outlook on my life and future got better as well because I was finally in control. I was creating a new identity that I was proud of, and things were great until they weren't. Slowly, I began to slip back into my own ways, but worse this time. Now that I was older, I had access to whatever I wanted or felt that I needed, and that's not always a good thing. A lot of the reason that I set out for myself on a journey to do the self-development lifestyle was to simply be an example to my parents and hopefully help them out. Over time has passed, I continued to try and nothing would work, and over time that completely broke me as a kid. I say as a kid, and at this point I'm talking like 18 or so young adult. And so at this point I became extremely depressed, and I came to the conclusion that I can't help them simply because I haven't walked in their shoes. And this is where everything went wrong, because I made the good decision to, well, if I can't walk in their shoes right now, why don't I just do what they're doing, and that way I would understand how they feel. So that's what I did. I started doing everything that they were doing, and that's where I lost myself. Due to what I've been doing, I found myself in the worst position of my life. On top of already being angry and very depressed, I developed extreme anxiety in this period of my life. And I'm not talking about the type of anxiety where you're nervous about an upcoming event, but the type of anxiety that leaves you restless at night. I've stayed up all night just hearing voices in my head telling me these awful things and terrorizing me all night long for days and days and days. And eventually it just compounded and started to get worse, where now it's, any kind of noise that I heard, whether it was a door shutting or like just a loud noise, it terrified me. And my mind would start making up these scenarios of what it could or couldn't be, and it started to freak me out. And it got so bad that even I thought my dog, who I love to death and she's the sweetest girl ever, was about to turn on me because I was looking at her and my anxiety was so high, and I started making up scenarios that she was like plotting against me, like severe, just horrible stuff. And it's like, I know it sounds crazy, but it's just weird. I noticed that I lost complete control over my mind, and I began to break down the identity that I just worked so hard to create. But this time, I was building a new one in the complete opposite direction of the last. The core of the new identity was fear. I was consumed and controlled by fear. I started listening to that doubtful voice that I heard when I was standing on top of the tunnel, about to jump. That voice was telling me not to, and that voice won the battle when I went back the second time. This lasted all the way into my 20s, and it was at this point where I hit rock bottom and lost myself. Where I stand now, it's very blurry looking back at this time period of my life between 16 and 22 years old. Between what I was doing and emotions I was constantly shoving deep down somewhere, it all kind of blends together. After spending so many years in torment, I started thinking back to the better days, back when I wasn't depressed and dealing with this horrible anxiety. I would just lay there at night and just ask myself, who am I? And I didn't know. I lost my own voice in the midst of whatever voice was in my head, which I like to say is the devil. Not knowing who I was anymore sent me down a rabbit hole of both good and bad. And it got worse before it got better. It started off with a midlife crisis. When I understood that the person that I thought I was not in fact me anymore, that really confused me. There came a point where I had to get real with myself and ask myself, who am I really? And most of the time my answers were my worst traits. I'm a fearful kid whose mind feels trapped in negative spirits. Or I'm the person that dreamed big but gave up because stuff happened and life hit me in the face and then body slammed me into a burning house off a 200-foot ladder. Just stuff like that, The more real with myself that I got, the better that it felt. It didn't feel good to know that a lot of the things I was beating myself up over were true, but I had to face it. If I was living in fear, I need to tell myself that, and I need to face it and figure out how to get better. And as I began to deep dive into it, it felt really good to expose all of those things that I tried not to admit, and it finally felt good to find out who I really was again. So whenever I go deep into reading a lot of books or listening to a lot of podcasts, I notice that there's always a line that I'll remember when times get hard. And it's funny because it's like when you're reading it or listening to something, it may not stick out to you then, but it just comes back to you when you need it and when you're struggling. And so I found that to be very helpful for me, and I started gaining momentum and changing who I was. I noticed that I was building the strength to withstand harder situations. I got better at dealing with my anxiety and how to talk to myself internally. I was building someone that I was proud of again and aligning myself and my goals to the person that I was chasing. Now, with all of these situations that I've been through, there was one thing that I realized, and that was that I was never lost. I was just exposing another side of me that I was unfamiliar with, and I haven't built that side of me up yet. I am the same person now that I was when I was jumping off the tunnel. The reality is, life is going to throw an endless amount of problems your way. It's up to us to work through those problems no matter how long it takes. There will come a time when you look at yourself in the mirror and you don't recognize that person, and that's okay. As much as it may feel like it, you haven't lost yourself. You're simply building a new part of you that you're unfamiliar with. When life comes to an end, it's all of these situations that you loved and hated that make us who we are. Times of stress, grief, love, fulfillment, they all play a part into who we already are. There will come a time in the future where you're met face to face with part of you that you haven't met yet, or something you haven't experienced it yet. And maybe you're experiencing it right now. Just keep in mind that you're not alone. You are you always have been you, and you always will be.